welcome to this week's Coaching for Self-Belief podcast with Andy and Pete. What have you got for us this week, Pete?
Well, there's a story around how to monitor, how to monitor in different modes, whether you monitor by feeling or whether you monitor and observe something by observing, and that both can be useful, really. So I was coaching a lady who wanted to work on two things. She wanted to work on her serve, and she wanted to work on getting more power on her backhand. With her serve, what was happening was that she was placing the ball quite often a little too far to the right, and so she was losing her biomechanical efficiency on it. And she was monitoring it quite well, and yet there were still some times where she thought she'd done a good serve. It went pretty fast and it landed in, so she was getting feedback from that. But what we were really looking at was her place up, as you know, whether she got an indicator from that whether to hit it or not.
So you could see her placement was too far to the right.
And so we talked about a way of her monitoring that visually, where she imagined almost a wall in front of her along with her shoulder line. And if she placed the ball up and it went through the imaginary wall, that then she could see that and not serve it. What we noticed was as we went through and began to test it and practice it a little bit, that I asked her, did she see what happened there? And she said, well, it felt good. And that was a sign to us that perhaps how she was actually by default monitoring what was happening was she was monitoring it by the feeling. And of course, she had an old habit of placing the ball a little too far to the right that had become comfortable. It might not have been the most efficient thing biomechanically, but she got used to it. So it felt comfortable. And then when she hit it and it went in and quite fast, then she had evidence that comfortable feeling worked. So she was kind of
which is what those two things that we sort of abide by to a degree, is that if it feels good and it works, they're two natural reinforcers of human behavior. But in this situation, you spotted that biomechanically it wasn't as efficient as perhaps it could have been, even though she's telling you that it feels good and she's seeing it works. It's quite interesting.
Yeah. And so it was an awareness raising challenge that we had. How could we raise her awareness so she could tell the difference between a serve that felt good but was less biomechanically efficient and the place up had gone too far to the right? Or could she tell the difference between that and a serve that had stayed with the place up a little bit closer to her body and allowed the body to do things a little bit more efficiently? So once we realized that she was monitoring by feeling predominantly, we just had a play and said, well, what would happen if you, as a challenge, could you put all your attention on visual feedback and really imagine that wall in front of you and see whether the ball goes through the wall, and that becomes your only way of working out whether that's one that you're going to serve or one you're going to not serve.
So this wall, Pete, was it to the side of her or in front? Where was the wall?
In front of her, close to the body, and just when she'd done the trophy position, it was level with her shoulders, parallel to her shoulders. So it was a way of visually checking whether it was a green light to hit or a red light to not hit. Once we did that and we identified it, then it went through the roof. The number of serves she hit with awareness just increased a lot. So,
Gosh.
really interesting, and that was news for her. That maybe predominantly her default was to observe things by feeling.
Yeah, 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 absolutely,
um,
absolutely.
and then, interestingly, with the forehand, the backhand, she wanted more power, and for that, actually using her default feeling way of giving herself feedback, that was the best thing for her to
Right,
feel.
right.
And where does the power come from? uh, to feel how loose the arms and the wrist and the racket felt. So for her power backhand, feeling worked better.
That was the better sense, yeah. And I suppose we've all got a dominant sense that we use. Um, but what you did in that session there was to help her use her other senses, i.e., seeing sense, a sense of seeing where the ball was, but where she was really more in tune with the feeling sense, which wasn't getting her results. But when you helped to bring her attention to the seeing sense, the body was then able to correct. And it sort of reminds me of the question, what do you notice? When you ask somebody, what do you notice? Then they go into their favourite default sort of sense, perhaps. But if we qualify that by saying, what did you see? What did you hear? What did you feel? That can open it up a little bit.
Really
But
interesting question
yeah,
to ask, where you can get to that level of information, finding out
uh,
what their default way of observing and monitoring, what's their
yeah,
default feedback mechanism, if you like.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I love the idea that that we can get highly skilled at feedback in any of those things, in visual, or kinesthetic
mm,
awareness.
because it's something we were brought up on, really. In sport, it's still around quite a bit. Is this, we can believe, and I do believe, until we had this conversation earlier, quite a high degree, that most sport is learned more through feeling. But you kind of raised my awareness a little bit that actually we forget about the observing sense as well. And so there are moments where, if in this instance we're not quite cutting it and we're not quite helping the person hit the shot, that there's another sense we can go to, as well as feeling, and just to be
Yeah.
aware of that.
Which, in that case in particular, it unlocked the problem that we'd come up against.
Yeah, yeah.
And the problem was that she was unaware of what was happening, uh,
Hmm.
because of her feeling was telling her that it felt good. And
That's right.
because
And it works.
she was in that feeling sense, she couldn't
Yeah,
see
yeah,
where the ball
yeah.
placement was.
So for me, the wrap up to this session is, for coaches and for me, from listening to this story, is to make use of the senses that we've all got. Feeling, yes. Seeing, hearing. I
Hearing.
hear a lot of coaches hearing. Yeah. I'm not sure if we can smell the tennis ball, but I'm sure some people learn that way. Maybe. But
Smell and taste are in there somewhere, but
yeah,
possibly
absolutely.
possibly to to much
Mm.
lesser degree.
So, and also when you ask that question, what do you notice? Don't just look for the feeling. Look for whatever they notice,
Yeah,
and sometimes
and
they'll say, "I."
actually, for me as the coach, my default way of monitoring, and when I go inside, my default way of seeing things is visual.
You're
um,
visual. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and so it's for me as a coach to watch that I don't assume that the
Mm,
person I'm working with is using the same default feedback mechanism.
mm,
And when I might offer them a way of observing something or monitoring something, that I mean, listen to my language. I'm talking about seeing and observing all the time, aren't
yeah,
I?
yeah, yeah. So that's your default position, but
That's
in
my
some
default
instances,
position, but it might not be the
you
most helpful thing for somebody else.
or for you, because you might be seeing
Yeah,
something, and that if I coach you and ask you what you feel, it might take you to another
that
realm.
might increase my awareness beyond
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
had been. So yeah, interesting
yeah.
stuff. Can we get
Good.
highly skilled at seeing and feeling and
Yeah,
even
and
hearing?
helping our clients.
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah,
Very good. So I hope that was interesting for everybody listening, and have
yeah,
some fun with that. You know, when you ask,
yeah,
what do you notice? It's what do you see? What do you hear? What do you feel? Which one is best? Very
absolutely.
good.
Good
Okay.
stuff.
Bye for now. See you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.